Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're still letting people in, and we'll just get started in a few minutes. Thank you all for joining us today. This session will be recorded, so if you want to go back, you can go ahead and do that on our website. And okay, I think we are getting a steady number of people coming in, so we can go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm pleased to introduce Chris Weber, Assistant Dean of Business Transformation for the UCLA Anderson School of Management. Most recently, he served as the Director of Career Advising and Corporate Outreach in the Parker Center Management Center at UCLA Anderson. Welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us.
Grace, thank you for your time today. And everyone, thanks for joining. I'm really excited about this session and encourage you at the moment while we're waiting for folks to come in and I lead through just a high-level overview where we'll go of putting in the chat what you're hoping to get out of this session so that I can reference back to it and make sure that we're covering the content that you're looking to get out of it. Today's session is very dynamic. So I have a couple of different activities that we're going to be doing throughout this session. So I hope that you have the opportunity to engage with your peers, telling stories to each other as we go through practicing some interviewing skills. So with that said, I also want to take a moment just to thank both Grace and Patty for all their support in getting this together. They are exceptional, and I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to work with them on this. So hello. There's a nice smile. Thanks for the wave. So today we are going to be looking at a couple different things. And some of it is going to be based on content that was already presented by my colleagues, Marcus Castaigne and also David Cooley. That will be our refresher section, and it will be super short. Today, we're going to talk about packaging your story. So as mentioned in the title, it's how to communicate is really the focus here. And we'll talk through two different structures that I think can help you anchoring your answers as you deliver your answers. What the session is not telling you the answers that you should give. Unfortunately, because everybody's story is very different and the jobs you're applying to potentially might be very different, the actual content is things that you'll need to think about how to weave it into these structures. But I promise you the two structures we'll go through today will be really helpful in shaping that content. I also have a bunch of exhibits that you'll get sent after this workshop, as well as a story planning chart that you can utilize to help set yourself up for long-term success with your interviews. So all that said, let's jump into the intro a little bit. And before I do that, actually, let me just check and see what people are looking to. So staying confident when unsure how to answer a question, we'll go through that. Sounding more natural and composed, yep, we'll definitely cover that. Refresher on skills, yep, for sure. All of those will be covered. So what is interviewing? Interviewing to me, storytelling. It's the exact same thing. The only difference is that the story this time around is you and all those things you bring to the table, who you are, your skills, your experiences, what motivates you, how you want to grow and learn, and then, of course, how you fit the company's needs. Storytelling is complicated. There's a lot of components to it. As you can see from that graphic, there's all these different elements. And as mentioned, we're going to be highlighting today communication and that opportunity to share. When you have good structures around how you communicate, your story becomes much more clear, and it makes it easier for the listener to understand what you're trying to share with them, and of course, how it links to what they need. The two structures we'll go through today are going to be the three things structure, and that's generally something when you want to list attributes or steps that you took, and we'll walk through what those specifically are. And then I'm going to go through my thesis on triangles versus diamonds, and always diamonds, avoid triangles. It's a little bit of a spoiler, but it's really important to understand what the difference in those answers are and how they sound to someone who's taking them in. As we go along, feel free to jump in with questions of, either through the chat or if you want to raise your hand, that would be helpful as well. And then Grace, if you could help me as you see people with questions, acknowledging them so that way I know that they're there. So let's move forward into the quick review. So value proposition. This was covered by Marcus a little bit in terms of what to think about. This may look familiar in that a value proposition is generally the crux of how you're presenting yourself to a potential employer. You have to think about what you bring to the table, what they are looking for, and where that intersection is. And granted, that's going to be important in all parts of applying for jobs, your resumes, your cover letters, et cetera. And when you build those documents, you then can take your interview answers from those documents based on your value proposition. As you think through what that means is that your interview stories anchored by your value proposition are things that then become easier for employers to understand. So just on the right here, we see that question that's really standard. Walk me through your resume. You're thinking about what skills you're bringing to the table, the strengths that you think you can contribute, and finding ways in which you can share that with an employer in a coherent way. In the back of the appendix, there's actually a diagram that walks through what that walk me through your resume answer could look like based on a skill summary. The idea here is that as you highlight what you're known for, you could then give them a skill and a quick example, before making sure that they understand where you fit with the role. This part of interviewing, we're going to cover those two examples, the three things methodology, and then also the diamond strategy in order to show how to answer a question like this. So bear with me as we move through that next piece around employers, so that way we can highlight what they're looking for before we do that. I'd like you, though, to just get starting to think about your own strengths. We're going to come back to this in an activity. So as you think through your own strengths that you bring to the table, have those in the back of your mind, because the activity we're going to break out and do in a little bit is going to require you to think through how to present these. In the interim, just to activate so I can see what you're thinking of your own strengths, take a second to put one of your strengths in the chat. It will give me an opportunity to think about how to frame some of the content below. So I'll wait for folks to problem solver. That's a great one. Proactive approach to work, written communication, persistence, anticipation, project management skills. Yep, these are great. And they'll allow you, as you think through all these different skills you're highlighting, people skills, it's ways in which we can tell our story really well. So I would encourage you, as you, again, keep in mind these 5 to 7 skills. You're going to need them for our next section. So continue populating that box to give people ideas on what they could be thinking about as well. Let's move to the company need. So Mark has highlighted a little bit about where you find what companies need. Here's some other areas that they show up. And I use UCLA as the example so that we can see how an organization like ours thinks about what's important to them. So oftentimes we see companies with a mission statement. And here UCLA lays out what its purpose is and what it's trying to achieve in the world. A company's mission statement is the highest level way of understanding what they're trying to do in their business. And then you could think about where you could provide value against that. The other piece where people can find good things to think about as building your value proposition is this parallel, is the values that they have. So UCLA has these true Bruin values based on this concept of raise. And those 5 elements of words that they find really valuable and behaviors they're expecting of their employees also gives you another way in which you can build your value proposition by demonstrating that you have these attributes. The most common one, though, is specifically looking at the job summary. And Marcus, I think, did a great job of laying out how to break this down. I'm going to do this really quickly. I encourage you to look back through his session just to make sure that you understand what to look for in these. So asking the question, compelling value proposition for the job, what does it look like? In the SCACs here, Marcus highlighted 4 categories of skills based on his understanding of this job description. He looked at management, and he saw that those populated in these. He looked at interpersonal, and those also appeared in those 2. Higher ed and understanding of the grants writing process, those appeared here. And then lastly, technology, which appeared here. Now, granted, there's a bunch of other skills that are highlighted from the history department in the left side here of the job description, things like problem solving, budget skills, strategic planning, like all those elements are things that they're looking for. And what we're trying to do is shape the things that you bring to the table against these skills that they're looking for, and telling really good stories of how you can demonstrate what they are looking for. Let's move into that section of how to start telling our stories with thinking through the 3 things structure. I'll pause here, though, just for a minute or 2 to see if there are any questions or comments in the chat that people have on the review section.
No questions so far.
Okay, yeah, I'm utilizing that skill that Simbi had put into the chat of patience just to see, and now we'll move forward to see what else is here. So I love this principle from Aristotle. 3 things. Tell them what you will tell them, and then tell them what you just told them. These principles allow you to think through how to deliver information for the listener to hear you very clearly. And these 3 principles, allow also for you to structure your ideas in a very clean and coherent way, allowing you to feel more comfortable with what you're delivering and even think through how to set up your answers a little bit stronger. So it looks something like this. So you have a summary list or statement of things that you want to talk about. You have your 3 things that are important to answering that question. And then you have a closing that makes it all come together. This is very theoretical, so I want to give you an example that's in practice that would help demonstrate this. And bear with me because I'm originally from New York, and I'm going to use an example of why the Mets are the greatest baseball team in this upcoming year. So the New York Mets are the greatest baseball team this year because of a culture of high expectations, exceptional pitching, and a deep bench of contact hitters. So in terms of a culture of high expectations, for you baseball fans, you know that the Mets are a bunch of lovable losers for a very long time. However, their new owner has instilled this culture of high expectations, asking more from them and expecting to win. That has changed the way in which the Mets operate, and I think has set them up for success, specifically because they have exceptional pitching. They have invested really heavily both in starting pitching, having 2 future Hall of Famers, and an exceptional bullpen that I think is going to carry them pretty far. The other half of that is that they play the game differently with a deep bench of contact hitters. What they do is get on base often and get them home often. Other teams like the Dodgers may use the big home run strategy in order to win games, but the Mets are going to beat people more consistently because they put the ball into play more. All in all, I think those 3 reasons are why the Mets are going to win the World Series this year. An answer like that, although the Mets have a lot of challenges, so don't quote me on them winning the World Series this year. This is just a way to organize your framework and thinking about how specifically to deliver an answer. Now, granted, this is a fun example. But this is going to be the first basis of our practice. We want to make sure that we're comfortable with laying out what's your high-level statement. And in this case, it was the Mets are the greatest baseball team this year for these 3 reasons: culture of high expectations, exceptional pitching, and then a deep bench of contact hitters. And then a little bit of detail in each of those before concluding why that made sense. What I'd like you to do is think through, oh, Tara, thank you so much for the Go Mets in the chat. That's awesome. What I'd like you to do is think through this exercise, but we're going to have you go into breakout groups to do, is you're going to give us the answer to what is the greatest category. And what I mean by that is that you get to pick the category. I don't care what it is. It could be your favorite book. It could be, your best sports team. But I want you to use the 3 things strategy to answer this question with a partner. So you're going to be in a room with one other person, and you're just going to set up this framework for them. This is the greatest thing in this category for these reasons, and give then your reasons, and then practice giving that closing as well. This, I know, is not necessarily an interview question, but it is going to lead to us then getting to an interview question so that we have some more fun things to talk about first. So Grace, if you can give me a hand and think about how we're going to put folks in groups so that they could practice this, or what you need for me to do that, that would be helpful.
The breakout room is starting now. Some folks will have 3 in a room though, just because of our odd number. So we're opening up the rooms now.
All right. Have fun in there, and then we'll see you soon. Thanks for joining from your sessions. Folks have got about 40 seconds to join. So in the interim, I'd love to hear how that went. So either feel free to jump in through the chat or volunteer. How did that practicing that structure feel? Still waiting on some to come back. So as you're joining us, thanks for participating in that breakout. I hope you got to learn things about your partner. I'd love to hear a little bit about what you thought about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now we need to. Okay.
Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed those conversations, learning about what someone else thought about their greatest thing. If I see some comments in the chat already about how people are feeling about it. So I hear it flowed pretty smoothly. It went great. Thanks for breaking us into small groups. Are there other thoughts of how the structure helped you to answer those questions, or what were some thoughts? Any volunteers?
Hi.
Hi, Nancy.
Hello. For both of us, we struggled with remembering what our 3 reasons were.
Yep.
So it would definitely require a lot of practice, because by the time I got to reason 2, I was like, oh no, what was my reason 2? So definitely need to practice.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is that one of the things about this in particular is that it's hard often, especially in the moment where you're trying to pull those 3 things together. This is one of those things where the more upfront prep that you end up doing, the easier it'll be. Our next exercise is actually going to be harder, because we're going to be doing this around your strengths. And that will be requiring you to think through, what's on my resume? What do I really want to talk about? This technique, the more comfortable you get with it, the remembering those things gets easier. Thanks for volunteering that, Nancy. I appreciate it. Any other thoughts before we move forward?
It was a great activity.
Thanks, Patty.
I actually did one on AMG and why it's so great. And if you need a volunteer later, I'm happy to do it.
Oh. I don't know. Thank you for being the brave soul to volunteer. Let's move forward a little bit to talk through this in an application towards more interview-related questions. This was the one to get started with, but now we think about it in terms of 3 things related to a specific interview question. Oftentimes they come through in questions like, why do you want to work here? What made you want to apply to this role? What are you thinking about when evaluating XYZ? What do you believe are your drivers of success? If you notice from all of those, there's an opportunity to present a list. Like, why do you want to work here? Oh, there are 3 reasons why I really want to join your company. Or what made you want to apply to this role? This role is exciting to me for these reasons. What do you think of when evaluating XYZ? To make that decision, I need to think about ABC. Like, there's a way in which that opening line quickly summarizes exactly where you're going, and then you can have your answers afterwards. The one we're going to practice today is based on your strengths. As just a reminder, we had you think about really quickly your 5 to 7 strengths, had you highlight one that was important to you. Now we got to think about that in the delivery of an answer. So again, this is something that when you get that question, what are your greatest strengths? You're thinking it through in the, what's my summary? What's my strength plus a short example? And then the second one, and then the third one. And then I believe these strengths will allow me to contribute to you because XYZ. It should be no more than 2.5 minutes as an answer. What often happens is that we get locked into giving lots of detail within the strength example. But you should think about it in terms of, if that strength 1 is the redefinition of that strength, and then maybe 2 to 3 sentences that showcases you using that strength, moving into your next example. This is really hard to do without a lot of practice. I recognize I'm going to ask you to go into breakout groups and try this, but what we'll do in the breakout group is really just focusing on getting one good example, saying the strength and saying a short example and trying to navigate through. In order to give you some sort of guidance on this, I'm going to try to demonstrate this for you so that you could see it, similar to the Mets example. But before I do that, I want to answer the question in the chat. In an interview, should we be talking about one strength or choose several? Excellent question. It really depends on the question. So in some cases, what is your greatest strength? 1. What are your greatest strengths? Plural. You have to listen to how the question is given. I'm going to give away a little secret that we're going to cover later as a pointer. If they ask you the opposite, what is your greatest weakness? 1, always 1. Even if they ask you what are your weaknesses, always just 1. Like, we never want to give them more on a question like that. If there's an opportunity to give more strengths, give more strengths. However, in negatively aligned questions. So what are your greatest weaknesses? Tell me about a time you failed. Why do you think this didn't go as well? We want to highlight just one of those reasons rather than give them a multitude across the board. We also want to think about in those scenarios, what's the way in which we demonstrate success? So in the greatest strengths answer, you give your strength and a success. You give another strength and a success. If it's a weakness question, you give the weakness, why you think you need to improve it, and a time that you then were successful at it. So you're almost pulling them back into the I'm still in a success framework. We won't go into depth into that two stories component of like it didn't go well and then it went well, but that's a way to think about some of the structure around weakness related questions. So let me give you this a shot and give you an example of the 3 things structured applying as if I'm applying to my current job as in business transformation. So my greatest strengths are analytical thinking, I'm being an empathetic listener, and being able to lead teams effectively. So in my previous role at Anderson, I was responsible for helping our students attain jobs out of the MBA program. And utilizing my data-driven skills, I analyzed specifically where they were struggling and created new structures and programs in order to make them successful in getting jobs and then getting being successful in those. In order to do that, I had to understand what our students needed and listen to them very carefully on what ways in which I can help them improve what the skills that they wanted to demonstrate. I also had to understand where our other stakeholders, like our faculty, our employers, needed support to help our students move into the positions they were looking towards. Those skills, particularly understanding where people are coming from, also helped me lead teams effectively. In multiple situations in all my previous jobs, I've had to create small teams or manage them to demonstrate project success by both defining what the scope of the work is, allocating the work, understanding what people needed to complete their work, and bringing it all together to produce the results. All 3 of those are extremely important in business transformation, where you are trying to make sure that you understand what is needed by the business, who needs that support, and how do you get them along for the journey, and specifically, how do you bring them into building success together. So I think these skills that I bring to the table would make me very effective in my role as business transformation assistant dean. That example, many examples in each, so highlighting the 3 skills at the front, giving the skill and giving a small example tied to it, a bridge to get me to the next skill, another bridge to get me to the next skill, all interrelated, allow me to build the case on why I think I would be good, hopefully, at the job that I'm in. This way of framing it, again, going from the short mini examples, the 3 things, allows you to build context for what specifically you are looking to get in that role. This is one of the more common interview questions. You're going to get this probably from every single interview you go through at least once in that process. So having a really strong answer, both tied to your value proposition, and going back to what you bring to the table, aligning to what they specifically need, are ways in which you can help create this structure for yourself as an interview guide. So let's have you try this. So again, this is not the easiest thing to practice, and I invite you to just try and see where it goes. We want to get you more comfortable with thinking through that opening statement, classifying a couple things that you bring to the table, and then give the person who's listening to you one example of the strength with a short little description of how you demonstrated that in the past. If you can do more, awesome. But no pressure if that's not coming to you now. I recognize that this is something that you will need to practice and think about in advance. So we'll do the same. We'll break you out into small breakout groups of 2 to 3. And you'll roughly have each person do 2 minutes of this exercise of telling what your greatest strengths are. As you listen, try to take in how they're structuring it. Provide them some guidance on like, oh, I heard this went really well. Here's some additional things I would think about. And we'll come back and have a broader conversation around this. Although as much as I want to hear about who your favorite sports team is and all this, this is where really our goal is today. So Grace, if you can help me send everybody out into breakout groups, we'll give you about 5 minutes in total to practice this, and we'll have you come back afterwards.
Yep, breakout rooms are now open, and we'll see you soon.
Great. And we're paused, correct?
Work. So sometimes the ball lost somewhere, right? So yeah. So, but anyway, so
Yeah, thank
yeah. Do you want? Yeah, you give an excellent.
Welcome back, everyone. 5 minutes goes pretty quick. Sorry, I realized I didn't give you a heads up that we would be bringing you back, but hopefully you had enough time to talk through what your strength or strengths were. Same question as before, like anyone want to volunteer how that felt or what was the way, what you got out of that experience? And again, feel free to use the chat or just feel free to jump right in. A little bit more challenging when it's about you and the things you bring to the table. Is that right? I'm going to state this out loud. Was helpful in organizing my thoughts. Thanks, Lori. I think I need to practice providing specific examples. Yeah, Christina, that's pretty common, is like trying to think of what your examples are. I'm going to walk through a little bit of a template to help you do that later as well. Any other thoughts? Relating the strength to the example. Yep.
I was
It's
just
also-
going to say finding the right words to describe, like I was helping someone come up with their strengths and how to use like the right language to not just say like, oh, I'm a really good listener, but rather like kind of like your example, an empathetic listener and problem solver. And some of it is putting in that work to, I don't know, I don't want to say, I don't know what the right word is, but to make your strengths come through with the right word choice.
Yes, for sure. I was telling Grace while you were all in your breakout rooms, I was like, going through my own strengths, it's been a long, it's been a while since I've done it as well. That middle one in particular, usually, me personally, I get the first one, I get the third one. The second one is always the hardest one for me because it's usually the one that I'm trying to like, it's strong, but it's not as strong as the other two. Even in delivering it to y'all, I felt like, oh, I could do that one better. And here's some additional things I could be thinking about. So it just naturally, you want to make sure that the words that you're anchoring to are ones that you're comfortable with and also convey what you need. It just takes a little bit of practice, which makes that part of this a lot harder. That idea of the content is the stuff that you take these structures for and put it in and practice with. Hopefully these structures, especially the 3 things one, especially we'll be using it in the diamonds examples as well, gives you things to move forward to. So just a couple other tips on like 3 things. So it doesn't have to be 3 things. It could be 2, it could be 5, it could be 6. It just depends on what the question is and how much time you think you have in answering that. So use your best judgment in terms of how to utilize this structure. If I said the Mets are going to win the World Series for 2 main reasons, that would be fine as well. If I had 15, you would all be bored, and so would I, and I would probably be lying at some point. So you want to make sure that you are holding it to the reasons why. These are the things that actually work. 15 reasons the Mets are great. I still haven't figured it out past 7. So this is a key one, especially when you have multiple interview questions in a row. So your summary statement should always sound different from the previous answer. If we go back to the 4 questions I had laid out before we got to the greatest example, imagine if I started every single one that said, there are 3 reasons why, yada, yada, yada. There are 3 reasons why this. There are 3 reasons why that. It sounds like you're on a script, and they will think of you as being inauthentic or potentially not someone who can communicate well. So shaping those summary statements slightly differently every single time allows you to have more of a dynamic conversation. It makes it feel more natural as a conversation versus like a very overly scripted piece. So that I think is a key, is making sure that however you set up your answers, try to make them sound a little different on the forefront. And then lastly, as we already covered, avoid 3 things on weakness-based or failure-related questions. Especially unless you're asked, like if it's like, give me a couple reasons why that didn't work out, give them a couple reasons. If it is, what is your greatest weakness? Don't give them 3. Like, just be smart about how you deploy this. You can use the same structure but you don't want to necessarily overshare information when it's not helpful to you. I'll pause there at the end of this 3 things section just to see if there are any other questions that you want to ask related to this before we move into diamonds versus triangles.
I have a quick question. So is it better to respond to interview questions like as quick as possible, or think thoroughly of what they're asking? And yeah, it might take like maybe 10, 15 seconds, but your answer is really thoughtful and it's not sounding very robotic or coached, or just like you've rehearsed this like 10,000 times.
I love this question, Monica. And I personally think take the time. Now, granted, you can't, it's the same thing like the summary answer should sound different. Every time you take a pause, try to tee it up differently. And there are 3 ways to effectively get yourself additional time. One is by acknowledging the question and you just need time to think about it. Second is giving them context, like why this question is important. And then 3 is thinking through a way in which you can frame your own experiences before diving into the answer. So an example of that is, Monica, I love that question. Give me a second to think about that. Or, Monica, I see why this is important for the role. You really need someone with XYZ skills. A time when I had that was XYZ. Or then this question is a really good one because what you're looking for is this specific thing. Let me take a second to think about what I have there. All of those buy you 10, 15 seconds to start organizing your thoughts and also sound very natural in the conversation. If someone dives right in, we're going to show what actually happens with our triangle answers, what that sounds like to a listener. And Nathan, thanks for that comment in the chat. Totally agree. Better to state your weakness and how you overcame it in the examples, especially if it's like, what is your greatest weakness? You try to demonstrate you state it, what you've done to improve against it, a time where you've gotten better at it, and how your love of continually growing is something that's really important. Like that arc tends to work really well in that specific question. And I saw one other in the chat. Can you talk a little bit about how to answer the greatest weakness question, please? Yep, I just did. So with that, we want to make sure, again, like greatest weakness is always about ability to overcome that weakness. It's state what you've been doing necessarily to improve against it, and give an example or 2 that showcases how you're continuing your growth. And remind them that you're going to still be good at the job because you have other things. If you can do that, that's another bridge. Any other questions, comments, concerns, hostilities before we move forward?
One more question. So
Yeah.
depending on what the role is, it could be really complex. And I mean, not that not all roles are complex, so
Yep.
it just depends on what the role is. There could be thousands and thousands of questions to prepare for.
Yep.
Like, I think this is something that I've come across, just how do you prepare for interviews when the employer or the hiring manager or whoever's like the search committee could ask you any types of questions? Like, how do you just feel prepared?
Yep, great
And
question.
yeah, and I've stumbled on that. It's hard.
One of the resources I'm providing to you is a list by the Muse of the 50 most common interview questions. So you'll have that as an initial basis. So you'll have that after the session is over. The thing that I tend to do when looking at job descriptions, and even as an interviewer, is that I look what I've written and then I determine what questions I can ask off that. And then if I could build out a half-hour script of 7 to 10 questions based on what's in the job description, I've backed into exactly what someone is asking. So for example, we always know that you're going to get a question about, tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. So that one should be well rehearsed. Greatest strengths, greatest weaknesses, always really important. Depending on the role, you're talking about teamwork, you're talking about data, you're talking about problem solving, you're talking about conflict. Like that probably is an arc of questions that is usually in your first round of interviews. If you have those ready to go, you can use your stories to answer those questions. It's almost like reverse engineer the process. What are the stories you can tell and what questions align against them versus what questions are out there and how do I answer them? The more confident you are in what you can tell those stories are, the more adaptive those stories can be against different question types. Does that make sense?
It totally does. Thank you.
Yep. Great. A lot of people come into interviews totally unprepared to answer questions. Google them. That list, I think, from the Muse is really helpful. What are your thoughts on how to approach a peer panel interview? Yes, there will be a link to this talk, so we'll all set there. Peer panel interview. Yeah, that one's challenging. So knowing the people who are interviewing you is both a blessing and a curse, because you know what they're going to ask, and then at the same time, you know what they're going to ask. So having your stories again, I think it goes back to what are the things that differentiate you in the way in which you want them to know about you. Now, when it's in a panel, they're all going to have things that are important to them. If you know who those individuals are in that panel prior to the interview, you could probably get a sense of what they're focusing on. Maybe ask about, what are the things they focus in on? What are the things that matter to them, and have stories related to that? For example, if you had a panel, for example, where you knew someone was really deep in data, well, they're probably going to ask you the data question. Whereas if someone else is more about like collaboration and their role is to bring people together, they're probably asking you about teamwork. We got to figure out, like, how do you get that information from your peers and what matters to them in a way that helps you then shape your stories. And you could say that, I know from your role, like, understanding what's in the data is really important. A time when I analyzed data and found great information to drive us forward was XYZ. The more relatable you can be to those individuals, the better that is. In going through this next section, triangles versus diamonds, it goes back to what Monica was saying and what Nathan highlighted about people being unprepared. Triangle answers are basically people who are unprepared, frankly. So what ends up happening is that people come into the question and they jump in before they haven't organized their initial thought. And then they tell a whole bunch of context of things that matter to them, but not necessarily in a way that matters to the interviewer. So there was this one time where I had this situation and all these things were happening and all these people were involved in this and yada, yada. And at some point we get to the point where they go, oh, I got to tell them about the actions I took to solve that problem. So triangle answers from an interviewer standpoint often come with a lot of information up front, and it's really hard to figure out where the information is that's the nugget stuff, the actions. And then, of course, angling it towards results is really important. Now, granted, this is the structure that we use for resumes, right? Situation, action, results. We ask you to think about, like, what's the context you were operating in? What's the things that you did in order to answer the question, solve the problem, work together with the team, et cetera? And what did that yield? But if they do not have what a diamond looks like, which is the results at the front, you often get really too wide, too fast. And what you're doing is effectively with a diamond is making this structure come together. So tell me about a time where you led a team to complete a project quickly. In my role, I've had that happen to me once before. Let me tell you about how I successfully led a 3-person team to put together XYZ. That gives the answer right up front. They already know you're successful. They already know what you're, at a high level, how many people are on the team. They already know what you did. Then you can shape your situation so that it has less information and it supports your results, as opposed to telling them all the situations that are going on there. This structure, and again, it goes back to practicing this at another point, writing out your answer maybe a little bit, but we want to make sure that you're leading always with an opening statement that allows you to answer the question quickly. These answers tend to be more focused. They tend to get the listener very actively engaged. That, I think, is really important, specifically in answers where there's a lot that you have to share. And specifically, these types of answers are really good when you're thinking about questions that might have answers to 2 to 3 minutes, is making sure someone could track all the way through. So what does this look like in practice? So an example, here's some examples of questions. Any of the tell me about a time when answers or questions are really good for diamond shaped answers. You're thinking through, again, answer the question quickly, give them enough context where you're moving through, give them your actions, go back to that result. The one that I want to give an example of is, what is your proudest accomplishment? So I have broken this out so to match the results section here. I don't have a prepared answer for this because it would take me a long time to go through it. I think it's better just to see the structure so that you can understand how to apply this to you. So Very simply, right from the gut up front, my greatest accomplishment is X and what you achieved with it. The second piece of this is when I worked on this thing, I needed to do these things. Something blocked my path. Here's what I was thinking. That's enough of the context to help me understand, like at a base level, how I got there. Granted, you could change this based on the type of question you're answering. You could change this based on your story, but this overall framework could help you think through some of your responses. The actions then you're highlighting, in order to choose the best path, I identified the following framework. So again, if this could be a 3 things, right? So in order to choose the best path, I identified the following criteria. I needed X, Y, and Z. And now I could dig into my 3 things in the middle of this answer that allow me to get to the option and why I chose it. And then lastly, ultimately going back to the results. Everything comes back to, if I answered the question at the front, I'm answering at the bottom again, and why this is important to me. This example, as well as a couple others in the appendix, will have really detailed, like, this is how you think about it. Here's some things to consider as you're shaping your answer, and will help you think through how to put diamond answers together. I'll pause here. I saw a question in the chat come up. How recent can or should the accomplishment be? Great question. It really depends on the role and what you're applying to and where the experience is. So in answering this question, you want to keep it as something that's important to you as it relates to the job you're applying to. If that was an experience earlier in your career, totally fine. If it was something that is more recent, also totally fine. I wouldn't typically go back more than 5 years if possible, because it'd be the question of, well, what have you been doing since then? But you want to make sure that whatever example you pick is something that relates to the job that you are specifically applying to. Great question, Nancy. I'll pause here before we dig into some of the nuts and bolts of the diamond framework. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Seeing none, I'm going to move forward. So here's some pointers, is that in those transitions, as mentioned, you could put the 3 things structure in there. So if we get from result statement at the front, your context right at the beginning, and then the action section can have like a 3 things in there that allow you to help structure within a structure. The second piece is, like, answers like this tend to be really long. Even if you're, trying to figure out your way through it, words like first, second, third, initially, then, next, finally, any list that allows the listener to know when a transition is happening allows them to reactivate. I know all of us have been in situations, or maybe it's just me, where I know I'm talking too much and I've got to figure out how to capture someone's attention again. Throwing in a word like next allows them to know that the next step is coming. We all think many folks think in a way that allows them to see a process. So adding those words helps them see your process more cleanly. Before I move out of diamond answers and into closing to show you a couple more resources, any other questions about what we've covered today? Okay. So let's talk about what all this means. So I'd love to just see in the chat some things that you picked out from this that have been helpful for you, or feel free to jump in with verbal comments as well. I'll give you a second to go ahead and populate those. Yeah, Varun.
Just a quick question. So if we miss the train of thought, right, and then we restart maybe answering that question, or maybe we find a connection between 2 thoughts, right? How do you make sure that the listeners are still engaged, or they did not lost the plot here?
Yep, great question. It's okay to treat it like it's a conversation. And granted, you don't want to do this too often in an interview because that might signal something. But if you said, let me take a step back and make sure that I'm explaining this piece clearly. Like that, I think is a good way to just to reset yourself. Or you could also say within the conversation, is there any piece of information that I just shared that would be that you would need more to understand here? And then you're asking for feedback a little bit in the interview to understand where they're going to go. If you feel like you've your response has completely gone off the rails, stop, acknowledge it, start again. It's totally okay. Like we all have that reaction. Every once in a while, it's just not going to be your best response. It's better to stop trying to force it and figuring out how best to reframe.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. I saw some great things coming through as in the chat. Thank you very much for putting those in there. Diamonds and triangles is very helpful. I saw a question here. So if you're an employer, would you recommend in-person versus remote interviewing? Great question. I think there's merits to both, and I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve. In most of the interviews that I'm using these days, it's hybrid. So some of the interviews will be virtual, some of them will be in person. It's the question of, if in-person allows you to get a deeper understanding of something, then utilize it. Knowing full well that there's a commitment to coming to an in-person interview, I wouldn't necessarily do that as your initial screener. But I would do it in the later rounds where you move the candidate from that initial conversation into something that's there. I personally think an in-person interview tells you a bunch of things that you're not going to pick up from a virtual format. And I would have at least one of those interviews be in person so that you can see body language. You can understand how they're interacting with other people. You can bring in more people into the conversation. Like sometimes it's helpful to have those additional touch points. Yep, definitely agree on these. Nathan, thanks for putting in there about describing, making sure you don't embellish. It is very, like I said, the Mets having 15 reasons why they're going to win the World Series. At some point, I'm going to be embellishing, so might as well not do it. Same holds true for things that are personal to you, is that if you're going to give an example, well, people will be able to find that information. So make sure it is factual and avoid embellishment as much in all circumstances. Monica, I saw you came off mute.
Oh yeah, I was still thinking of whether or not I wanted to ask it, but some jobs want you to demonstrate your certain skill sets.
Yep.
What's your take on that, or how do you best prepare? Because I know there's some like prepare a specific presentation or show me XYZ. I don't know, just what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really believe in the portfolio assessment. And by that, I mean like having both conversation as well as demonstrated ability to do pieces. I wouldn't, if you are an employer doing this, I wouldn't give someone a homework assignment that's going to cause them like stress for days. It should be something that they could do in a very discrete timeline that gives you a sense of what they're thinking and how they approach the problem. And you should be forgiving if they don't get the answer that you specifically are looking for. So in most cases in those presentations, I care more about like, how'd you go about thinking through this? And are you in the ballpark of what we would do? Not assuming, oh, you know my business and you could tell me exactly what we need to do to transform at UCLA Anderson. I wouldn't expect that out of anyone. But I do think there's merits to it if it's important to the job. If it is not something that, like, if you don't need it, don't force someone to do it. But I do think there's health advantages of having that.
Thank you.
Yep. Brian, I saw the question, is it a no-no to talk about yourself in the third person? Sometimes I would say probably yes. It's unless they were asking you, what would your colleagues say about you? I think in most cases you want to be answering from your own direct experiences and making sure that they can link the fact that you're communicating about you specifically in the narrative. Can you speak about the use of personality assessments like the one health system uses? That's a great question, Nathan. I actually don't have experiences in personality assessments as part of an interview process. I'm actually really curious to hear more about what the health system uses in order to do that. I think there's merits to personality assessments, just much like there's merits to many of these assessments that we use. But assessments are tools, they're not answers. Like, they help you understand certain things, but there's context that's outside them that I think is important to make sure that you're factoring in. If you are going to use an assessment, then there should be some other personality assessment. There should be other ways in which you're getting more information from the candidate in order to make sure you're getting a complete picture, not just what one assessment said. I recognize we're at time, so I want to be cognizant of your time. I'm going to run through two things really quickly so that you have these as well. As mentioned, you're going to have the slides from the session afterwards. I've also included this interview chart resource. As mentioned before, writing out your stories or jotting some notes down is really helpful. This is an Excel document with some common questions that you could just set yourself up for. It's really important to have multiple examples demonstrating different components, so that way you don't come back to the same story every single time. So what is your greatest strength? Provide an example, give me multiple examples. In the same thing, if you in leading a team, like give me examples of that and have multiple ready for yourself. The other piece that's important here is just where else can you go for additional information? So as mentioned, and I'm just going to show one really quick, I took some time to write out a way in which you could think about your answers for a couple of the key questions that we see come through. So you'll have these to look through. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but peruse them and hopefully they help you structure some of your answers. The other pieces are, there's a lot of other resources around interviewing. So LinkedIn Learning, as you may know, UCLA has access to this, as well as through your public library if you have connections there. These two courses, Mastering Common Interview Questions and Improving Your Listening Skills, I think are actually really helpful in both being an interviewer and an interviewee. There's also the Toastmasters resource at UCLA. And as mentioned before, this is the link to the Muse's 2023 50 most common interview questions. So that could give you a list to prepare for as well. But I really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much for engaging. I recognize it's in the middle of the day during lunch and I'm asking you to jump into breakout sessions and apply some learning on some stuff you haven't practiced before. I appreciate your trust in me to make sure that that was something you wanted to participate in, and hopefully it was helpful. I'll hang out for a little while longer if you have additional questions, but thanks again for your time today.
Thank you, everyone.